Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Carol Parrish, president of California Delta chapter of Pi Gamma Mu, which is the National Honorary Social Science Fraternity. And we're very proud tonight to have a very excellent program planned for you. And without further ado, I will introduce the Vice Chancellor of the University, Dr. Foster Sherwood, who will introduce the speaker of the evening. Dr. Sherwood.
Thank you. Every year, UCLA presents 3 lectures under the sponsorship of the appropriate scholarship honoraries, one in the natural sciences, one in the humanities, and one in the social sciences. This year, the social science lecture tonight is particularly fortunate in having as its guest of honor an individual who has a career that is a kind of ideal academic career. After his formal education in Sweden in law and economics, he came to the United States, and he tells me he has traveled over the United States and visited every one of our states. Not many of you here tonight can make the same claim. He has practiced law, he has taught, he has served his government as an elected member of the Senate, as a minister of the Department of Commerce, as a member of the board of directors of the Swedish Bank, and he has taught and written widely. He holds many honors and honorary degrees from many universities in this country and abroad. He has served not only his nation and his profession, he has also served the United Nations, where he was a member of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe for some 10 years. He is presently a professor of international economy at the University of Stockholm. He has written many books and articles covering a vast field of economics and demographic studies, of international economics, and has shown a deep understanding and concern for problems of economic disequilibrium and of the problems of emerging nations in the modern world. It is my pleasure and honor to present UCLA's social science lecturer for 1966, Professor Gunnar Myrdal.
Mr. Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, this was a long necrologue, but I'm still living, even after 2 days here at this university, where I've been busy every hour. I'm supposed to speak about the United States and the integration endeavors in Europe. And I want to preface my remarks this evening with the explanation that I'm not speaking as a representative of any particular government, my own or anyone else's, or of any particular political or interest group, but simply speaking for myself as an independent student and on the basis of what knowledge I have and my own value premises. That is not, I admit, a suitably modest opening note to strike, but I do believe it represents the proper function of the student and one that makes him a healthy influence for preserving the political climate we call democracy. In that connection, I cannot help feeling somewhat anxious when so many of my colleagues in America and elsewhere either escape into academicism or expertness, talking abstrusely only to each other, or are merely satisfied to sing in chorus whatever refrain happens to suit their country's official policy. On either plane, we are not contributing to government through discussion, which is the essence of democracy. By using our freedom and our knowledge and what authority we have to project to our peoples a higher level of debate on public issues at home and abroad than that aimed at or achieved by most politicians and others who serve particular interests and do not ordinarily possess any profound knowledge of public issues and still less any comprehensive and balanced views of the facts about them. At this point, I cannot resist the temptation to recall Bernard Shaw's maxim that the reasonable man adapts himself to the world. The unreasonable man persists in trying to adapt the world to himself. Therefore, Bernard Shaw says, all progress depends on the unreasonable man. At any rate, to serve the course of democracy, the scholar must see the facts as they are and without concern for what appears to suit his country's or any country's official policy. He should also be prepared at times to set aside academic dialogue and the other trappings of learnedness and make his knowledge available in the simple terms that the people can understand. The profession of scholarship should not be a recondite conspiracy against the common man. My old teacher, Gustav Cassel, who was a great economist before and after the First World War, and who would be 100 years just now if he had lived. He used to say that nature is simple, and the duty of the scholar is to work so hard and intensively that in the end he would get things so simple that he could explain it to a maid. Cassel had his fundamental training around the century turn and had it in natural sciences and mathematics, which might explain this thing. I know that nature is not simple, particularly not in the social field. Nevertheless, I feel sympathetic to his conclusion that we must try, we who are devoting all our life to intensive study of social problems, to be able to come to certain inferences, certain conclusions, which we should be prepared to present to our to people in general in such terms which are understandable. I think there is a dangerous tendency in my country and in your country to complicate things with unnecessary terminology and with models which are built on assumptions which has nothing to do with reality, to escape into techniques for its own sake, and because of that, to escape from the reality. When the problem of poverty in this country has been raised as a public issue, I'm sad to say that this was not the result of the tens of thousands of professors in economics, which are my colleagues, but was the result of the findings and the eagerness of social workers and politicians, and in the end, members of chambers of commerce who saw that poverty was dragging the country backwards, which I don't think is a healthy situation. Well, now, I've mentioned the word value premises, and perhaps some of my, one or two, perhaps in my audience, will know that it is my conviction that problems in the social sciences cannot be rationally posited except in terms of definite and explicit value premises. They are needed. They are the only means of making social science studies objective. We are always have values with us, and the only way of dealing objectively with problems is to state the value premises from which you proceed. They are needed in both the theoretical and the practical stage of analysis, not only in order to draw the political inferences about what ought to be done, but also to ascertain the facts themselves and the relations between the facts. Things look different depending upon where you stand. Without, on this occasion, being in the position to develop further the philosophy of knowledge upon which this methodological rule is founded, I will begin my lecture by first stating in general terms my value premises when judging the integration endeavors in Europe and the positions the United States has taken towards them. And as I proceed, I hope to be able to render these value premises somewhat more concrete and specific. My major value premise is that the rich and rapidly advancing countries should now accept the responsibility following from their position of economic strength for opening their boundaries to the flow of capital and commodities, and so inaugurate an era of freer trade, as did Great Britain a little more than a century ago when she was more economically advanced than other countries. That this policy in Britain was to the great advantage of herself and not only the outside world is a generally accepted historical fact. There is no reason to believe that the rich countries today would not benefit individually and collectively by following that great example, or that it would have anything else than wholesome effects for the great majority of people in the underdeveloped countries. It is true that following such a line would require from each one of the rich countries disciplined fiscal and monetary policies at home so as to preserve internal balance, and also a readiness to negotiate among themselves the international arrangements needed to overcome minor maladjustments and to keep the international liquidity on the level demanded by the growth of trade. Without being able to develop these themes now, I simply state my conviction that this is fully possible. It's fully possible to meet these requirements. This is one field where policies in all rich countries are sadly lagging behind the science and technology of economics. When rich countries bring themselves into a position where they must interfere in the free flow of capital and commodities in order to defend their balance of payments, it is a testimony to weaknesses, on the one hand of internal discipline, and on the other of international cooperation in the common interests. I said freer trade. Although the great bulk of interference in the flow of capital and commodities could be liquidated in a general move toward economic disarmament, without more than rather minor and temporary disturbances, which the rich countries could take in their stride toward ever higher rates of productivity. There are some specific fields where not even the rich countries can avoid interference, where interference will be continually needed. One such field is, for instance, agriculture, which in most rich countries has to be supported for social welfare and other reasons. My second value premise is that this interference, which stands as an exception to the general rule of free flow of capital and goods, should ideally be adjusted by international agreements to meet the common interest as well as national interests. Such agreements must encompass all countries which as exporters or importers have a stake in it. This rule has in the post-war period become established for international commodity agreements, though as yet we have not progressed far toward the substitution of this type of internationally agreed regulations for unilateral national action that pays little or no regard to the effects on other countries. Applying these two value premises, it's clear that protective trading blocs like the European Economic Community cannot be welcome on economic grounds. Whether they are desirable for other reasons, in the first place political ones, I will touch upon later. What I've said so far refers to the rich countries. They should remove restrictions on trade and capital movements among themselves and on exports from and capital movements to the underdeveloped countries. The underdeveloped countries on their side cannot possibly abstain from controlling their imports in order to protect their slender industrial beginnings and to defend their exchange balance. Neither can they abstain from controlling capital outflows. My third value premise is therefore that the rich countries should recognize what I've called a double standard morality in regard to commercial and financial policies. For once, if I might note that, a double standard giving greater license to the weak and not to the strong, as the rule is in a world where power and not morality is ruling. The rich countries should thus open their boundaries in all directions to the flow of commodities and capital without asking for reciprocity from the underdeveloped countries. As one Indian statesman once formulated it, equality between unequals is inequality. Indeed, what is needed in a world today in order to give the underdeveloped countries a chance to develop are policies that are discriminatory in their favor. Grants and loans on non-commercial terms belong to such policies, as does preferential treatment given to imports from underdeveloped countries. I should add that we should even view with sympathy the attempts, as far as yet weak and not very successful, in underdeveloped regions to form protective trading blocs. They need to join together behind a common protective wall against the rich countries for the same reason that they cannot participate in a general drive toward freer trade. By increasing the size of the protected areas, they would improve conditions for enlarging the division of labor among themselves, and in particular for availing themselves of greater opportunity for external and internal economies in the international industrial field. Though I cannot, on this occasion, develop this thought, I want to mention that these value premises, which I have stated as basis for my analysis, have their deeper roots in the inherited ideals of liberty and equality, which I have called the American Creed, but which are common ideals in the Western civilization as an inheritance from the Enlightenment era. While the classical economists in Britain worked out the free trade theory that served as a rationalization for their country's drive toward freer trade, in America, prominent economists developed a theory for national protection. In the field of practical policies, the outcome of the Civil War weakened the export-minded southern states. Thus, from about the same time when Great Britain and Western Europe, to some extent, went in for freer trade, the United States became more solidly protectionist. After many vicissitudes in the historical evolution of commercial policy, American economic nationalism reached an almost hysterical peak during President Hoover's administration when Congress passed the Wholly Smooth Tariff Act in 1930, and when the unilateral depreciation of the dollar torpedoed the World Economic Conference in London in 1933. American economists who had then long since been moving toward the free trade theory protested by the thousands against the Wholly Smooth Act. But this caused hardly a ripple on the surface of American politics. This represented almost, I would say, the accumulation of the American contempt for the intellectual, the egghead who had not met the payroll. Very soon thereafter, however, the ideological and political trend changed direction. Under the leadership of that great Southern liberal statesman, Mr. Cordell Hull, who in 1933 had become President Roosevelt's Secretary of State, the free trade theory was gradually made the bedrock of commercial policy planning in Washington. There is a continuous line of progression from the wartime preparation under Cordell Hull for the International Trade Organization to the astonishingly rapid acceptance, with only a few distorting amendments, of President Kennedy's Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which gave the President of America the power to negotiate a very radical lowering and, under certain conditions, even a complete abolition of customs barriers. The line was not a straight one. Few historical developments are. Thus, the International Trade Organization was killed at birth by Congress after all the work that had been done to get international acceptance of this American initiative. On the other hand, the negotiations in GATT had, at the passing of Kennedy's Act, already resulted in a considerable lowering of the highly protectionist American tariffs. The new authority now conferred on the President to negotiate very large tariff cuts was in many ways a final step, decisively putting the United States in the free traders' camp, prepared to take the lead that Britain took a century ago in a drive toward freeing international trade. Meanwhile, Britain had, in the period between the two world wars, gone protectionist, like most of Europe, except Sweden and a few other progressive small countries. And Britain was now also so weakened, economically and politically, that a position of leadership in the world was beyond her reach. This Trade Expansion Act conforms in the main rather well with the value premises I stated in the beginning of my lecture. Its deficiencies from the point of view of these value premises are more in the nature of shortcomings than of deviations. Thus, the Act is mainly aimed at freeing trade among the rich countries. That's my first value premise. It does not present a similar dramatic challenge in favor of stabilizing markets for the traditional exports from underdeveloped countries, and still less for giving them preferential treatment for their exports of industrial products, which was my third value premise. On the contrary, the United States has, like other rich countries and rather ahead of them, been putting up hindrances to an expansion of their industrial exports on the world market, for instance of textiles. There is, however, nothing in the Act or in the general policy attitude that it expresses that stands in the way of complementing it with a determined acceptance of the double standard morality in favor of underdeveloped countries. In the same way, the challenge of the Trade Expansion Act is simply directed toward the goal of lowering tariffs. It does not spell out the desirability of international cooperation aimed at transforming the residual interference in trade that cannot be abolished in a general drive toward economic disarmament, and which should be negotiated and agreed upon in order to serve not only a national interest, but the common interest of all countries, which was my second value premise. Here again, such a complementation would not in a fundamental way, however, be contrary to the goals of the Trade Expansion Act. Whether the negotiations initiated as a consequence of the Trade Expansion Act, the so-called Kennedy Round, will have any success at all hangs, as we all know, in the balance. A failure, which seems increasingly probable, could well direct the development of the rich countries' commercial policies, and in the first-hand instance those of the United States, into a new, more determined protectionist phase. It would increase the difficulties of complementing the free trade drive in the two respects I indicated. As we also know, the main obstacles encountered in the Kennedy Round have their origin in policies pursued on the European continent. In the first place, they are consequential upon European integration endeavors. that in turn have been supported and conditioned by American policies. These latter American policies, to which I shall return in a moment, were from the beginning directed toward other, less internationalistic goals than those that in their mature form became the beacons of the Trade Expansion Act. In part, the two categories of goals were contradictory. If the Kennedy round should end in failure, therefore, I mean that the United States government itself, by its own policies toward Europe, will carry a main responsibility for this outcome. When the Second War ended, the European countries were economically in a desperate situation. The United States, on the contrary, emerged from the war economically stronger and better off than ever, which is a rather unique situation in the world. Protected by ocean distances, it had of course not suffered material destruction. It had entered the war with the vast, underutilized productive resources, above all unemployed labor, and the tremendous rise in public expenditure for war purposes accomplished what the New Deal had never succeeded in doing, lifting the United States out of the Great Depression. There was thus an almost logical foundation for the great American post-war rescue action, the Marshall Plan. All the same, since government policies are often so irrationally selfish, it needs to be reiterated that this was an act of outstanding generosity. In a strange American fashion, which I have analyzed as a sort of perverted Puritanism, the American insists always, even when it's doing good things, that it's doing it entirely in the best interest of the United States, and the whole world is eager to listen to that. I think I know the people in this country well enough to testify that the basic motivation was at that time not self-interest. The Marshall Plan had two main elements. The biggest and most conspicuous was a huge amount of financial aid, amounting to the tremendous sum of almost $30 billion, more than two-thirds of which was straight grants, without reckoning military aid. The second element was the acceptance on the part of the United States of a systematic trade discrimination against its own exports. Indeed, United States officials took a leading part in working out this system of discrimination against America. As we all know, the Marshall Plan was a great success so far as Europe was concerned. The West European economies recovered more rapidly than anyone could have believed possible. They were able relatively quickly to relinquish most of the import quotas, which was an inheritance of the war, and other physical controls on intra-European trade, and gradually also on those directed against imports from the United States. Their currencies became convertible, though mostly with the maintenance of exchange controls directed against capital outflows. Still more remarkably, bulging prosperity and financial strength have in a marked degree descended upon just those countries of Western Europe which were most exhausted and destroyed by the war, and therefore relatively the most weakened initially, namely defeated Germany and Italy, together with the countries that had been overrun by the Nazis and were later liberated by the Grand Alliance of the United States, the Soviet Union, and Great Britain. Pretty much, in fact, das neue Europa, or die Festung Europa of Hitler's dream word, shorn of those eastern dependencies that have disappeared behind the Iron Curtain. Later, it was these same countries which were to join in the protective bloc of the so-called European Economic Community. Britain, for various reasons, among them her bigger defense commitments, fared less well. The main fault of the Marshall Plan, as I saw it then and as I still see it today, was the United States' over-generous policy in giving its huge financial aid mostly in the form of grants instead of loans on easy terms. I never believed that the giving of aid as gift from one government to other government was a necessary, natural, or even wise policy, except when the beneficiary is an underdeveloped country with deep-seated structural disabilities to overcome. This financial policy towards Western Europe, the rich countries, during the Marshall era, looks even more peculiar in retrospect when we recall how now and in recent years the principle that aid to underdeveloped countries should mainly be in the form of credits have become ever more firmly established, even though it was bound to become increasingly obvious that they will never be able to repay them. The Western countries, by contrast, came in a position to pay back, and there is no reason why they should not have done so. That the United States would have been a considerate creditor is clear from its record. A back payment even now would still indeed be a contribution to world monetary stability. It is the continental West European countries which, by stacking up gold, have endangered the dollar exchange system upon which international liquidity depends. They have even created fears, in my opinion unfounded, though I have not now the time to give my reasons. I gave that in an article of a periodic which is called Index in last summer. They even created fears, I said, that the international value of the dollar was in danger. From the beginning, and now I come near my real topic, of the Marshall era, the United States used its influence to urge the West European countries to integrate economically and, if possible, politically. Behind this policy of wanting Europe to integrate were a number of mixed motives. For one thing, the Americans are proud of their own union, which has successfully amalgamated people of very diverse origins into one nation. This analogy is weak, however. In America there was an historical basis of British traditions, and this permitted the United States not only to have one language, English, but also to become the world's earliest modern democracy. The country was also in a sense a new one, and was rapidly expanding geographically as the western frontier moved forwards to the Pacific Ocean. Nature and distance surrounded it with a political power vacuum which the Pax Britannica safeguarded. Western Europe, on the contrary, is already fully inhabited. It is divided into a number of nation-states, each with its own distinctive personality and usually its own language. Even apart from internal rivalries in the sub-region, it certainly does not operate, taken as a unit, in a power vacuum. Nor are its traditions British. There is in particular little on the European continent of what makes the United States a firmly anchored democracy. Those nations in Western Europe that are really akin to America in civic ethos, namely Britain and the Scandinavian countries, are and have always been outwardly directed in economic and in all other interests. Another illusion in America, as in the rest of the world, which has grown up during the last half century, is an exaggerated idea of the superiority of bigness. If there is any correlation at all between the size of a country and progress, it is, of course, as you all know, a negative one. Not only are the smaller countries generally richer, but also better administered, their streets are cleaner, and they are more advanced culturally generally. I had a visit 1.5 years ago by one of the present members of the Labour government in Britain, who was particularly eager that Britain should join the common market. And I said to him, don't let us make propaganda with each other. We know each other. We know the arguments. You know that there's not very much to say for it economically. Why do you want to have this join Britain with this continental power block. Then he said, in order that we shall be a big power. And I said, what's your interest in being a big power? If you go, I could say, now to the University in Los Angeles, you will not be listened to more because you are from Britain than I, if I am from Sweden. As a matter of fact, there are certain advantages of not coming from a big country where you're always more suspect of standing for a particular interest. What's the big idea? It's a little like when people discuss whether they want to live in a big apartment house or have their own house in a suburb. I mean, we might have different ideas about it, but very definitely it's not a very clear thing that it's important to belong to a bigger establishment. Let's also recall, which is very forgotten, that all the great intellectuals in the 19th century, people so different as Thomas Jefferson and Marx, all of them were for decentralization of power. They were not people who were in for, getting big power established in big states. If I should look forward to a progressive and peaceful world, my valuation is, I wouldn't say that America should break up in several states, but I would hope that boundaries generally would mean less and less, and that more and more actual power could be given to smaller units in the United States. That is, when you have solved your race problems and all the other things, which in this particular country makes a federal government almost necessary for progress. This is a big topic, and in this context I have to constrict myself to pointing out that recent research has discounted the popular idea that economic progress in the United States has its historical explanation in its bigness of the markets. It has more to do with the spirit and institutions of the nation, with the richness of its natural resources, and with its political stability. We find also that a small country like Sweden, which is well endowed in the same way as the United States, shows a rate of economic progress over the last century which is almost identical with that of the United States. And this in spite of the fact that the United States for a long time had the advantage of receiving grown-up immigrants, while Sweden was in the opposite position of having to feed and rear children and youths only to lose away them in migration. I mean, all really empirical studies about this is discounting this popular idea that is the big common, the bigness which explains progress, even if the idea will be very difficult to sell to a larger audience in America. But this is just what the facts point to. It's clear that all countries, big and small, have an interest in international cooperation. International cooperation is quite possible without supranational organs. And it doesn't need what we now call integration. Generally speaking, it's not the small countries, historically, which have raised difficulties for cooperation between sovereign states, but usually the big countries. It is mostly the big countries who have been protectionists. Yet in spite of this protectionism among all the big countries, the small countries have progressed more rapidly and more. Sweden, with the lowest tariffs in the world, is also the richest country. In my opinion, it's equally as rich as the United States. It has statistically, the United States has 1/3 higher national gross product per head, but if we shall take into consideration everything which must be withdrawn in a comparison, I mean the compensation and cost for a less perfect organization of society, the indirect tremendous cost of the huge slums in America, and its expenditure on fancy adventures in the space and preparing for the flights to the moon, which are not inexpensive thing. If you withdraw all that, it's my judgment that you come out that the ordinary Swedes are just about as well off and perhaps a little better off than Americans. The American stake in West European integration, however, was mainly rooted not in economic advantages, but in political and military considerations. The United States has twice within living memory been drawn into world wars originating in Europe. A closer integration was also seen as providing a stronger basis for the military alliance the United States had created in NATO. As it turned out, what emerged was not one organization but two, the EEC and the EFTA. In 1957, that is well after the end of the Marshall era, 6 continental West European countries concluded the Rome Treaty, and the following year formed the European Economic Community, popularly known under the euphemistic name of the Common Market. These countries wanted in various degrees a tightly knit organization, held together by common economic policies and above all by a common protective tariff wall against the whole outside world, apart from their former colonies, mainly French former colonies, which would form a system of satellites. Britain and Scandinavia, who traditionally are more outward directed, they are seafaring people, later joined by Switzerland and Austria and Portugal, and in a way Finland, refused to be subjugated to the EEC's supranational, heavily bureaucratic system of the Court, the Council, and the Executive Commission. This apparatus, in the incarnation of 6,000 bureaucrats in Brussels, from a Swedish point of view, speaking and writing a language which nobody in our parliament or among our people can understand, and operating outside normal controls of representative government. The assembly can only dispose of the council if they have a 2/3 majority, if I am not wrong, and if they don't succeed, those who have proposed it must leave. It's a little like the constitution of Pakistan, or otherwise the Pakistan has taken the common market constitution. Well, now, this apparatus was invested with powers that our peoples would not dream of delegating to our own administrative agencies, and not even to our government, in spite of the fact that it has a parliamentary basis. The group that did not join EEC put their trust in a simple freeing of commerce while preserving their individual tariffs to the outside world, and were content to rely upon the market forces to bring about necessary mutual adjustments without interference by supranational authorities. On one point I felt critical towards the orientation of EFTA from the outset. With their outwardly directed spirit, the countries in that group should not have considered themselves so exclusively only a unit for bargaining with the EEC countries. With their primary interest for freer trade, they could have invited the whole world, outside world, to participate in their strivings. And with the absence in their organization of the heavy supranational bureaucracy, they could more easily have accommodated special interests by permitting the exceptions which most of the countries outside Western Europe and North America would have needed. I've said before, and I want to repeat it now, that no American senator, living or dead, could ever have thought of voting for the United States joining a supranational bureaucratic and undemocratic organization like EEC. Nevertheless, the United States government threw all its support behind that organization, while EFTA, which in spirit and practice is so much nearer American ideals, became almost a dirty word. It put all its strengths behind arranging a shotgun marriage between EEC and Britain, and failed miserably, as we know. It's been said by Bernard Shaw, to quote him again, that marriage is popular because it combines the maximum of temptation with the maximum of opportunity. The proposition might be true for individuals, but I mean, it should not excite our views about the relationship between nations and states. It's not an easy thing to explain that American posture. In a minor way, EEC's general discrimination against the whole outside world has a sort of ideological sanction in this inherited queer and irrational American partiality for a complete custom union as against an incomplete preference system of the type Britain has built up in the Commonwealth. Also, the supranational, bureaucratic and undemocratic structure of EEC, which can hardly have aroused American enthusiasm, was played down. These features of EEC cannot have been overlooked, however, in Washington, though we should not minimize the American government's ability to live in illusions or become mesmerized by its own propaganda. But mainly, the American attitude must have been motivated by political and military consideration. It was apparently the belief of the United States government that a supranational organization, at that time rather firmly directed towards political unification as well, was a means of strengthening NATO by furnishing NATO with an economic basis. To attain this goal, the United States was apparently prepared to pay the price of a protective and discriminating tariff wall against itself and the whole world. It was also willing to see this economic and military organization have its center of power on the European continent, where the tradition of political democracy is so much more frail than in Britain and Scandinavia, or in the United States. In particularly, there was in Washington too little thought given to the problem of how to coordinate the American policy in favor of European integration, in this sense, with the policy line inaugurated by the Trade Expansion Act of '62. This is the reason why I said that if the Kennedy round ends in failure or near failure, the United States will have to shoulder a heavy part of the responsibility for this most unfortunate result. The one thing the United States government apparently did not see, and nor, as far as my readings are representative, did most of the economist commentators in this country, is that an organization like EEC by necessity makes all international negotiations more cumbersome and more difficult to bring to a successful result. You see, even if the EEC had not run into its present grave difficulties, which you know about from the newspapers, it would have imparted a hybrid of unity and diversion. It's neither a government that can negotiate on behalf of all its members, nor is it an arrangement that can leave to the member governments free to negotiate for themselves. Recalling all the important issues which have to be solved by time-consuming and often frustrating proceedings within the community, every member has to take consideration of the others. To reach a common policy line to outside world must under all conditions be most difficult. Often it will be the position of the member who takes the most negative line that must prevail, as they cannot get the unity except by accepting his terms. The American government seems to have been unaware of this consequence of an organization of an EEC type until it had to cope with it in the Kennedy round. Well, the collapse early in '63 of the negotiations for British membership of EEC was a defeat not only for Britain but also for America, for American policy that had so conspicuously been trying to herd Britain into the organization. That the British negotiations and their outcome aggravated the crisis already brewing within NATO instead of strengthening NATO is also certain. That the gloomy prospect for a successful result of Kennedy round is due to the structure and development inherent in the EEC, which came into being with enthusiastic support from the United States, is a third conclusion we should not avoid facing squarely. In sum, up till now at least, the United States interventions for West European economic integration has resulted in failure. And I think this should be clearly seen. Well, but bygones are forever bygones, and we are always starting clear at each moment, to quote the great economist of an earlier generation, Stanley Jevons. At least that should be our guiding principle if we want to be rational and more successful in the future. I rather wish governments, and in this case the United States government, would be more ready to recognize facts, to cut the losses, and prepare itself for fresh and new departures. The United States, as a great power, has influence. But as we have experienced, and as you have all read in the newspapers, that influence is not always decisive. Financially, the United States is not strong against the EEC countries, which have stacked up gold and occasionally used this strength, notably in the case of France, for purposes hardly distinguishable from blackmail. Commercially, United States is also a rather weak bargaining position. I mean, it's so common for Americans to believe that they are so big, they are the greatest country, the highest national income, they are so strong. I mean, but when it comes to commercial bargaining, America is rather weak in Europe. If you take the Scandinavian countries with no more than 1/10 of the population of the United States, the Scandinavians import as much as the Americans do from the EEC countries, and Sweden alone imports half as much. The United States exports, on the other hand, which they will have to find space for in negotiations, are more than twice as much as the Scandinavian countries, and almost 4 times as much as Sweden. And while America has to plead for easier access for its wheat and poultry exports against more particularly strong French interests, Sweden exports industrial raw materials like wood products and iron ore, and in addition products of high technology that in very recent years have proved their competitive strength and power to surmount tariff walls, even fairly high ones. The United States, having failed to force a widening of the EEC in Europe, is bound to pursue now, I hope, more directly a policy of worldwide freer trade among the rich countries. If, as I hope, the United States is not giving up that policy line, embodied in the Trade Expansion Act, it will need the support of all like-minded countries and of like-minded people in the EEC countries themselves. A tragic fact on these circumstances is that Britain, which would have been a natural ally and is in fact an ally, has got itself by bad policies since a couple of decades into a position of trade and exchange weakness, which prevents it from taking a vigorous line in the fight for economic disarmament. But time moves on, and even the British position might become stronger. Meanwhile, we have all to pray that the United States itself, in spite of its recent failures in commercial policy in Europe, will not revert to protectionism, which is such a strong American tradition, but will stick to the enlightened policy laid down in the Trade Expansion Act to lead the world towards freer trade.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are very, very grateful to our distinguished visitor here tonight. We're grateful to the audience, and we think we've learned something very valuable. And so tonight I will now close the meeting. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.